Good. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Let us start for today's session with Mr. Sebastion Bernstein. Mr. Bernstein is a partner director of Synex Consulting Engineers since its start in 1990. Previously, he played a major role in a Chilean power sector reform carried out in early 80s. In 1982, he co-authored today's Chilean electricity law, and Mr. Bernstein served as executive director of National Electric Commission of Chile. He also advised governments in energy sector reforms in over 20 countries in South America, Canada, Africa, and Asia. He also conducted power market studies for investors and lenders, including International Financial Corporation, AIDB, and OPIC, intended to evaluate existing or greenfield generation projects as well as transmission projects. Mr. Bernstein has been a member of board of National Petroleum Company of Chile, of the National Coal Company of Chile, as well as other generation companies. He's an engineer of École Centrale de Paris and University of Chile. So thank you, Mr. Bernstein, for having a time for us and sharing your ideas, which I believe is highly relevant to Mongolian situation today. And our institute is established to provide progressive ideas so that we will improve as a for our economies as well as society. The Progressive Policy Institute is established, and its major role is to study best practices internationally and make it relevant to Mongolian situation. So, floor is yours, Mr. Bernstein. He's muted. I'm sorry, I cannot hear you. Yes.
Now. Let me. Well, okay. I will skip this. Can you hear me right now?
We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. Good morning to all of you. I am really grateful for the kind invitation from the Ministry of Energy authorities and from the Harvard team to participate in this discussion and hear this presentation on some key aspects regarding competitive the operation of competitive power market. And I am really honored to have this audience. I had the pleasure to work in Mongolia in 2004, 2005 with the World Bank when we were hired for providing some, I would say, preliminary concept on what could be a power sector reform switching to a competitive market in Mongolia. So I had the pleasure to travel at least 2 or 3 times to Ulaanbaatar at that time, and I remember that as a very pleasant work. Well, my presentation will focus on some key features of competitive markets, and I will just describe what was done in Chile, and at the end just make some few comments on things or issues that should be very carefully analyzed in Mongolia, and steps that might be taken if there is the willingness to go further in this type of reform. I will try to show my presentation. I believe I have that. Excuse me. Can you see it? No?
Not yet.
Do you have it on presentation? No?
Yeah.
Yes, we have it.
Yeah, we have it.
Okay, I have it here. It seems to me.
Perfect.
Is it working?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, fine. Thank you. So I will start with some features of competitive power market. Initially, then show the Chilean experience and then issues in the case of Mongolia. Well, one of the first things to see in that is in competitive wholesale electricity market, say at the generation supply level, generator compete for supply, and at least in further development of this type of market, no central planning. So decision for investing are free decision taken by the agents, by generation company, for instance, in terms of the technology they will choose, the size, startup date, commercial strategy, fuel purchase, commercial and commercial strategy, as I just mentioned. And in this type of markets, the consumer are the one that select their supplier. For that purpose, it is absolutely necessary that open access must be set to the transmission and distribution grid in order that competition will be developed in order to supply large end consumer, which we call LU here, and also for supplying distribution company for their regulated consumer. So in general, there are no regulated price at the wholesale level, say generation and supply level. And generally the supply to the distribution companies for their small regulated consumer will be established through two possible mechanisms, either through bilateral negotiation or through competitive auction, which is the most developed mechanism to guarantee that acquisition price by the discos would be performed at the least possible price. In the wholesale market, the agent established a medium and long-term power purchase agreement, what we call PPA, which usually lasts from 2 or 3 years to up to 20 years. In the case, for instance, of mining consumer in Chile, we have PPA which lasts 15 years. In the case of distribution company, we have PPA 15 to 20 years, which are established in the case of large user by bilateral negotiation between the GENCOs, the generation companies, and the consumer. And an important feature in this type of wholesale market is that the PPA are financial contract. They are not physical contract. What is a financial contract? It is a contract where the supplier commit to supply the demand of its client independently if it is dispatched or not, or at the level at which its generating units are dispatched. So there is a commitment to supply anyway, and certainly there are some risks that the supplier has to consider when setting this PPA, because if he, we will show, if he is not able to be dispatched because of its variable cost is high, then he will have to purchase in the spot market. The spot market can be challenging for its long-term behavior. So in this type of market, in all type web wholesale electricity market, a spot market is absolutely necessary to clear the difference between the hourly dispatch energy of a given generator and its commitment. So this we explain in the following point how it works. If the energy dispatch is in 1 hour is less than the committed demand established in the PPA, it has to purchase the difference from the spot market. And if the dispatch energy in 1 hour is is in excess of the committed demand, he will be selling the difference to the spot market. And it can be demonstrated easily that the spot market is always available because the energy produced is equal to the demand. In a small and medium-sized competitive wholesale market, like those that were developed in Latin America, the dispatch is mandatory and is usually performed by an independent system and market operator. This system and market operators is in charge of dispatching the unit in some ways to have the least total operation cost of the system, which is something which is traditional in dispatch as dispatch criteria, and it is also in charge of managing the spot market. The dispatch, as I said, is performed on the basis of minimizing the total system operating cost, and it is evident that this is performed when the dispatch is performed on the basis of the merit order of the operational cost of the generator unit. The spot price is calculated on an hourly basis or every half an hour or every quarter of an hour basis as the system short-run marginal cost, SRMC, which represents the cost of the system for supplying 1 additional kilowatt hour. This is the meaning of marginal cost, short-run marginal cost, and which represents for the system the variable cost of the last unit, which is dispatched for meeting the system demand. And we have to say that the spot price calculated at the system short-run marginal costs are highly volatile because they depend on what type of unit is generating in certain period of time, and it will depend usually on full price and on the exchange rate when country is importing the fuels. Like most of the country, I understand that this is not the situation in Mongolia because you produce your own coal. Just to mention that the use of short-run marginal cost is applied in small and medium-sized countries, in very large countries, or where the installed capacity is very large, like most of the European countries. The spot price is not set on the basis of the short-run marginal cost, but on the base of the price of the marginal price offer. So it is based on free offer for the short term. But one can demonstrate that if there is not a power market, both values tend to converge. So in a competitive, very competitive framework, the marginal price which is offered is very close to the short-run marginal cost. Just a comment. Now, how it works, you can see that in this chart. You have several generation companies, G1, G2, G3, and whatever the number that you have, which have a long-term contract or PPA with large consumer. In this case, we represent C1 and C2, and several distribution companies, the number that you want, D1 and D2, and this price, which are commitment to supply the complete demand of the consumer, are set at non-regulated price through long-term PPAs. In the case of distribution, these prices are usually set, as I already mentioned, through competitive auctions rather than having bilateral agreement. And the difference between the actual dispatch of each unit and its PPA commitment is traded in the spot market. So generator G1, for instance, if it is generating less than its contract with C1 and C2 in this example, he would be purchasing in that hour from the spot market at the spot price, which I already mentioned is the short-run marginal cost. And certainly you can also have long-term contract between generator. They are free to get such type of agreement. Well, it can be demonstrated that if a spot market, like the one that we have described, is set on the basis of short-run marginal cost, the short-run marginal cost applied to the energy concept, so it's expressed, let's say, in US dollar per megawatt hour, then a capacity market must also be considered, aside from the spot energy market. The capacity market allows to remunerate the capital cost and the fixed O&M cost of the peaking unit that are necessary in the system to foster the reliability. Usually they are set on the basis of regulated price or on the basis of bid or auctions scheme. One can select one or the other, and usual values are in the order or in the range of $5 to $10 per kilowatt per month. So it is important to set up a capacity market together with the spot market. I will not go into too much detail on that. Just to mention that all PPAs, either with large end consumer or with distribution company, must be backed by firm capacity from the supplier, and the firm capacity is valued at the capacity price resulting from the mechanisms that I already mentioned. So either regulated price or a price arising from an auction proceeding. Generators that do not have PPA, it may happen that the generator appears because he cannot complete or he cannot get sufficient PPA in the initial year of its installation. He is able to sell its production, its whole production, to the spot market at the spot price. And its firm capacity is also paid by the capacity market. Certainly, when he sells at the spot to the spot market at the spot price, he is taking risk because the spot price is very volatile. It can be high, it can be medium, or even in certain cases it can be zero. So there are risks in taking that commercial approach. That's why PPA are mostly recommended rather than to sell on the spot. And on the contrary, consumers which do not have PPA can purchase energy and firm capacity from the spot market. So there is always an alternative to acquire energy from the spot, to sell or to acquire. Now, one important thing is that in our experience, the main driver for competition and for the development of competition at the wholesale level is the PPA market, not the spot market, because the spot market is highly volatile. It changes. And PPA are a useful tool for the supplier, for the generator, because it establishes a commitment to deliver energy at a known price, which is set in the PPA for a number of years, which allows get financing from the lenders, from the banks. And from the standpoint of the buyer, from the consumer that are purchasing through the PPAs, the advantage is that they're purchasing energy at a known price, which allows security of service and a guarantee of price. Let me mention that PPA price are always set under competitive pressure. So they tend to reflect the system long-term development cost under competition. which are close, that can be demonstrated from the economical theory, it is close to long-term marginal cost. Certainly, when a generator establishes a PPA, he must be checked. He has to check that the price will cover its capital cost and operating cost, but under competitive pressure, as I already mentioned. Price of PPAs are usually adjusted by indexes in order to reflect the evolution of the cost of structure of the supplier. Usually, the indexes which are used are the CPI, Consumer Price Index, internal from the own country or from the United States, for instance, and also the exchange rate. Because if you have a devaluation and you are importing fuels, then the price may go up, and you have to index your price in such a way as to be protected against a devaluation. In terms of transmission, this is a regulated activity. Usually the regulation is established in terms of the obligation to expand under a central planning scheme or through bilateral agreement. Usually the central planning scheme is the most usual approach for expanding the transmission system, which must provide open access to any supplier of distribution company or large user. And the transmission charges are regulated in order to reflect cost. These transmission charges are usually reviewed from time to time, say every 2 or 3 years, in order to reflect variation of the cost of structure of the transmission line and substation. The quality of service is also a regulated matter, and there might be, in some countries, there is a single transmission company, sometimes owned by a state, or there might be several transmission companies which might be privately owned, which is the case of Chile, as I will show. In the case of distribution, you have almost the same type of regulation. There is an obligation to serve anyone connected to the grid. In the case of the small consumer, which are regulated, the tariff are regulated, the price are regulated for a small consumer below a certain level, but the distributor has to provide open access to any supplier for supplying non-regulated consumers, say large user connected to the grid, which might be supplied by third parties, by anyone, by any generator. So open access must be provided by the distributor. Regulated tariffs, I already mentioned that. And for regulating tariff for the small consumer, the price is set as the generation price, say the price at which the distributor acquires or purchases the energy, plus the regulated transmission charge, plus the distribution charge, and the efficient losses for serving, for providing the energy and the capacity. Usually, these small regulated consumers are defined by a certain level. For instance, in the case of Guatemala, this level is set as 100 kilowatt. But I would have to say that in more advanced competitive framework, like those developed in Europe, all consumers are eligible. So all consumers, even if they are very small, say residential consumer, can select their supplier, and the price has to be agreed on a bilateral agreement. Well, I will go now to describe what has been going on in the case of Chile. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, I don't know if you have a question on what I already mentioned, or if you want to make the question at the end of the presentation, but I am open if you have comments or questions on the part I have already developed.
It's okay, Sebastian. We can ask the question any end of your presentation.
Okay, at the end. Okay. Well, Chile has a very special geography, as you can see on the right-hand side, and we have a very long interconnected system, which has close to 3,000 kilometers long, and with several cities located mostly in the central south area, but we have huge mining facilities located in the north of Chile. The population is 20 million. The GDP per capita as of last year is $21,000 in power purchase parity. And the power sector is currently, or since in the last 30 years, has been 100% privately owned. The installed capacity is, or the gross generation, which is mostly important. The installed capacity is around 31 gigawatts, and the gross generation is 81, has been last year, 81 terawatt hour, so 81,000 gigawatt hour. And coal is relevant, as you can see in this picture, 34% in 2021. In 2022 was generated by coal units, 34%, and 18% by gas, imported gas, because we import LNG. And the balance is 20% hydro, and what has been increasing is solar and wind, which those years represented around 21% of the total generation. Well, the system was reformed. It was state-owned before in the 60s and in the 70s. And the driver for the reform, which was performed between 1980 and 1990, was the willingness to switch from a central planning economy to a market-based open economy. This happened not only in the power sector, but in the whole country, in all economic areas of the country. And the objectives of the reform in the power sector were, as mentioned here, economic efficiency, foster security of supply, which was very weak when the reform started, try to prevent political interference in the management and decision-making, for instance, employment or forcing projects that were inefficient for the country, and also decentralize and regionalize and setting up an environment where private participation could be developed. And the main tools for reaching these goals were, as I mentioned here, to replace regulation by competitive market, basically at the generation supply level where you can develop competition. But you have still to regulate monopolistic activities like transmission and distribution, but based on economic concept rather than on accounting concept. All this was performed in what was defined as the subsidiary role of the state, where the role of the state is mainly focused on setting the rule of the game rather than participating in production. And the subsidiary role of the state also means to subsidize areas or activities where the household are not capable by themselves to cover the cost because the poor people do not have enough money for doing that. So there were specific subsidies for developing grids, mainly in rural areas where the low density of distribution necessarily have very high costs. So subsidies were established, and there were also some cross subsidy in distribution tariff for residential consumer located in rural areas where the distribution costs are or were very high. This reform was materialized in 1982 through the electricity law, which is still in force with some change, but the key concepts were maintained of the law. At that time, the size of the system was around 3,000 megawatts. Just to point out, right now, the size is 31,000 megawatts. The reform was led by the National Energy Commission, which was in charge of the duties that usually are performed by a ministry. In the case of Chile, the ministry was just recently created. The National Energy Commission was the body in charge of setting up energy policies in Chile. So the law established in 1982 allowed unbundling the main state-owned vertically integrated generation companies, which was called Endesa at the time, and it also unbundled Chilectra, which was state-owned, which has small quantity of generation, but was the largest distributor in the country. And it separates and bundled this company in several generation and distribution companies. The key tools for making possible this unbundling was defining price between these new separated companies. At the generation supply level, a spot market was established based on the short-run marginal cost plus a small capacity component, which I already mentioned. PPAs for bilaterally agreed, so deregulation of price for PPA with large consumer, mainly in that large industrial consumer and mining consumer. And the PPAs with the distribution company were established on the basis of projected spot price, but set between a range of the average of non-regulated price. So it was kind of half regulation of this price because they were set around the non-regulated price. And transmission and distribution charges were regulated on the basis of economic concept, which are more efficient than accounting cost. And the regulation for a small consumer was set as the price at which distribution company acquired the energy, plus the regulated transmission charge, plus the regulated distribution charges and losses. And all prices were set in foreign currency, in US dollar, and then converted to Chilean pesos. We have to mention that in Chile, all fuels, or most fuels were imported. So, and since they were very important for price setting, and there were also many components of substation which were imported, so assets, fuels, capital costs of generation unit, etc., are usually imported, and so the conversion to the expression of price in foreign currency and then using the exchange rate to convert that in peso was a very important matter. Well, the initial unbundling of Endesa was successful in terms of distribution company, but there were reluctance from the company to be separated in its most important part. So it took some time to unbundle the total Endesa. This took several years. And we have to mention something which might be important in the case of Mongolia, which is in the first year, the wholesale market was mainly operated by state-owned companies, which were the companies separated from Endesa and Chile. But the management was performed in a competitive framework, but letting the state-owned company not anymore vertically integrated, letting them compete. So initially, there was a system planning scheme for checking the decision from this generation, transmission, and distribution company. But afterward, the planning was abandoned. There was only an indicative planning scheme, not a mandatory planning scheme. And the privatization was performed progressively between 1985 and 1991. So we have some figures here on the size of the system and the number of generation company. We have 4 very large generation companies, 9 mid-size generation company, and a lot of medium and small size generation company, several transmission company, because we do not have monopoly. The law does not allow a monopoly in transmission. And in distribution, there are a number of 4 large distributors, which several subsidiaries and several very small distribution companies. And the market operators, as I already mentioned, we have PPA between the generator and the large consumer. The distribution company purchase on the basis of auction, which are performed from time to time. And the difference between the dispatch energy and the commit energy in the PPAs are traded in the spot market. From an institutional framework, we have what I would say is very common in most countries that have reformed their power sector. We have the Ministry of Energy, which was created 10 years ago, which set the energy policy, issue laws and bylaws and concession. The National Energy Commission is the regulatory authority in charge of regulating transmission and distribution charge and proposing detailed bylaws and detailed regulation. And it also coordinates the auction that are performed from time to time by the distribution company. It's a coordination between the regulator and the companies. We have a separate superintendence of electricity and fuel, which supervise compliance of quality and service and apply penalties. We have an independent system operator, which manage the dispatch and the spot and capacity market. And we have also a very original figure, which is the expert panel, which settles dispute between the market agent and the regulator. In such a way as to have an independent settlement of this dispute. So in general, the key aspects are the separation of generation, transmission, and distribution companies, competition in generation and supply, as I started in the same way I started this presentation, no central planning, open access to transmission system, the distributor purchases energy under auctions, and they establish long-term PPAs. All eligible consumers purchase energy in the free market, which represent around 60% of the market. And all transactions that are not agreed under a PPA are performed in the spot market. We have regulated and transmission and distribution charge and regulated tariff for small end users, which in the case of Chile have been defined as those below 500 kilowatt, not kilowatt hour. We have an independent system operator, which I already described, in charge of system dispatch, compute spot price, make settlements, monthly settlements of spot transaction. And in Chile, something which is particular to Chile, all consumers must have PPA. only the consumer can trade in the spot market only exceptionally, but in general they must have PPA. And this was set that way in such a way as to avoid the exposure to highly volatile spot price. I will show you the way in which spot price varies in Chile. So the drivers for competition are long-term PPA. It's through the long-term PPA that competition is developed and new power plants are coming online. As I already mentioned, long-term PPA price tend to reflect development cost, say the long-run marginal cost of the most efficient competitors, and these PPAs are not based on short-run marginal cost. The spot price, I emphasize that once again, is only for trade. Hourly difference between dispatch and contract commitment, they are highly volatile, but they have to be considered by the gen cost, by the generator, when establishing PPA, because they will be exposed to the spot market when complying with their PPA commitment. How the system has evolved. In the case of Chile, if you look at the left of this chart, in the initial, I put in this chart what has happened from year 2000 onward. And at the left-hand side, you can see that in blue, we had hydro generation, which was very important, in black, coal, and in gray, gas, which was imported from Argentina. In 2005, the gas from Argentina started to be curtailed because they had internal problems. And the gas was completely curtailed, and we have to replace that gas by what is shown in red here, which are diesel generation, which caused a lot of problem in the case of Chile, because we had to import huge amount of diesel oil in replacement of the gas. And as a reaction of the market, because the price of diesel was very high, you remember that at that time, the price of oil reached $150 per barrel at that time. Then a lot of coal units were installed. This is why I explained this. You can see here that in black, what is in black start to increase because a lot of coal units were installed, and the imported gas from Argentina, which was imported through gas line, was replaced by LNG. So we had to construct LNG terminal for replacing the Argentinian gas. So gas continued to be imported, but as LNG and coal started to increase in a very significant way. And since 2015, wind and solar started to be competitive for supplying distribution companies and also for supplying industrial company and mining company. And they started to replace coal. Solar is in yellow, and in blue you have wind. This chart shows the variation of spot price. And in red, you have the variation of PPA price, of the average of PPA price in a certain period of time. So much more stable PPA price than spot price, which reached $350 per megawatt hour in certain period of time, when we had to replace the Argentinian gas by diesel oil. Then the system slowly adequate, and the spot price have decreased. The current price for new contract are in the order of $50 per megawatt hour, while some 1 year, 2 years ago, they were around $100 per megawatt hour. Something particular to Chile is because we have very high solar radiation in the north of Chile, central north region of Chile, and this graph on the left show the installation of solar in blue. Before 2014, we had almost no solar power plant. Right now, that was last year, we had close to 8,000 megawatts in solar. And this year, in 2023, we have an additional 3,000 megawatts in solar. So we will finish this year with 11,000 megawatts in solar power plant. And in the case of wind, we had also an evolution. In 2022, we had 4,000 megawatts, increasing steeply. And this year, we will have an additional 1,000 megawatts installed in wind. And coal is dropping because it starts to be replaced by this renewable form of energy. And for instance, in 2022, by the end of 2022, the coal generation dropped to 20% instead of 40% in the year before. And we have to mention that we are starting to have a new type of problem, which is the excess renewable generation in certain hours. You have on the right-hand side the dispatch of November 17 during a working day, and you have in yellow solar generation, in blue on the bottom you have hydro, and then you have wind. And there are some moments in which the excess generation of renewable is leading to spot price or marginal cost equal to zero. For instance, yesterday, the spot price between 10 in the morning and 5 in the evening were zero all over the system because we are having excess renewable generation. Well, since the Argentinian gas crisis, several additional concepts have been considered as part of the energy policy. First, avoid excessive dependence from a single fuel supplier. That we learned this Argentina lesson because all the gas was curtailed. And a new policy on decarbonization started to take place in 2018 in order to contribute to a zero real emission target in 2050, which is a target that is usually applied by many countries in accordance to climate change agreements. We started with 5,000 megawatts in coal units, but all of them will decommission by 2032. So in 8 years, all coal power plants will be decommissioned. And this is a decision that has not hurt the owner of this coal power plant because the variable cost of coal under normal condition are higher than the development cost of renewal. So they are willing to dismantle their units. And on the other hand, the consumer, the mining companies in Chile represent 1/3 of the total demand, are requesting green energy. So they have been closing all PPAs established with coal units because they are requesting renewable energy instead. Right now, the authorities are fostering through regulation the use of batteries for storage because of the problem that I already showed. The zero spot price during certain hours because we have excess generation in certain hours, but can be tackled through the use of storage system. Well, that's almost all I can say regarding Chile. Now, focusing, I have two more slides or three regarding some comments or ideas on what may happen in the case of Mongolia. First thing is that the current structure of the power sector is based on a command and control policy, where you have a centralized planning scheme and limited competition for IPPs through the single buyer concept. The single buyer concept certainly is use competition, but the degree of competition of a single buyer scheme is much lower than what can obtain through a fully competitive wholesale electricity market. So when a country switch from a centrally planned scheme to a competitive market, he has to rely on the investment decision, and efficient price might be set through bilateral agreement between seller and buyer. Consequently, an intention to develop a competition requires the acceptance that electricity price will necessarily vary over time. So you cease to have control on that in order to reflect supply-demand equilibrium. And for instance, a situation due to, for instance, a devaluation will have an impact on price, or an excessive surge of demand will also have an impact, because the equilibrium between supply and demand will move upside. So when one move to a competitive framework, one have to accept that price may go up or down. Certainly, private participation is possible, as I mentioned, in the single buyer concept right now, if you provide sufficient guarantee, but this scheme is less efficient than a fully competitive market. So once again, this requires an absolute reliance on the stability of market rules. So accept that price may go up or down, and rules must be stable, transparent, and cost reflective for all activities that have price regulation, like transmission and distribution. In the case of Mongolia, which rely on coal, mostly on coal, there are two issues. One is that, as we know, with the exception of China and India, international operator and developer of coal power plants are abandoning coal due to commitment regarding climate change. And at the same time, large industrial, mining, and commercial consumers are also abandoning supply through fossil fuels in order to sell their product under green certificates. Just to give an example, in the case of Chile, BHP, which has one of the largest mining facilities in the north of Chile, they are purchasing around 500 megawatts. They were purchasing around 500 megawatts with fossil fuels and a small part with hydro. They canceled all the PPAs. They paid a compensation to the supplier of around $800 million for canceling this contract, and they opened bids for the supply through green energy. So just to show that some consumers are the pusher of the switch from fossil fuel to a renewable form of energy. Now, so one key question is whether, from a strategic standpoint, will Mongolia continue to rely on coal? Probably it makes sense, because you have lignite at a low price, but one should analyze very carefully this situation from a very high government level. The price of coal in Mongolia should necessarily reflect economic cost. So if Mongolia is going to rely on coal for the next, say, 15, 20 years or 25 years, the cost of coal, of lignite in this case, should reflect economic costs and should be credible from the standpoint of investor. So subsidies should be removed if possible. We do believe that as a first step, prior to taking a decision on a power sector reform, it would be worth to determine cost-reflective price at the generation, transmission, and distribution level, and analyze potential distortion of this true reflective cost with the current price. I don't know if what is the degree of distortion that might appear right now, but this exercise we believe would be necessary. And certainly transparent and specific subsidies might be considered for low-income households in order to prevent, if price had to rise, in order to prevent social unrest. So subsidies, focused subsidies are a tool that should be used. I understand that we already have this type of subsidy in Mongolia. In the case of generation, it is necessary to assess the economic cost, which are different from the accounting cost or book values. It is absolutely necessary to assess the full capital cost, considering an appropriate weighted average capital cost and the economic life of the asset, as well as the fixed O&M cost and the cost and fuel cost in the case of lignite, and also the cost of solar and wind. I understand that solar and wind are mostly developed by private companies, so they are already doing this type of exercise. For assessing this transmission and distribution price, benchmark or simple methodology can be used as a preliminary exercise. And certainly the provision of district heating, which is something very special to Mongolia, must be assessed and its impact on electricity price. There might be or might not be impact, but there should be a careful analysis on the relationship between the provision of electricity and heating. In a second step, once this exercise on price would be terminated, a preliminary or in parallel, a preliminary design on competitive wholesale electricity market and regulation should be performed. And for instance, the creation of a spot and capacity market, who would be the operator, what would be the rules, etc. And PPAs should be based on financial contract, and also there would be an assessment of the extension of the competitive market. Why I say this? It is because I understand that large users represent a significant part of the demand, and one can consider that competition could be set for large user and keeping some regulation for the distribution company, at least for their regulated consumer. So you can, in initial year, design a system where you have competition for large user and still some degree of regulation for distribution company for a smaller user. And certainly one have to clarify or try to clarify what would be the private participation in all these segments: generation, transmission, and even generation, distribution, and even in transmission. And as a third step, a simulation of the operation of the competitive WEM that would be designed in order to evaluate what would be the price of electricity and what would be the variation of price that might appear at the generation and at the supply level, including a small consumer. So with this, I will finish here because I have this presentation has been too long. The following slide just clarify some lessons from Chile, but since I already described what has happened in Chile, I can skip this to this last slide. So thank you. I am sorry for this the extended presentation, and I am open to comments and questions from your part. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sebastian, for such an illustrative presentation that was very informative for us. And if you guys don't mind, I'd like to start the question session with a couple questions. In the case of Mongolia, 2/3 of energy is used for creation of heat, and 1/3 is used for electricity. So that complicates the entire transition process from centrally planned to a wholesale market. That's how we see it. So I was wondering, like, what was the case of Chile? Did you only look at the electricity generation, and was the initial condition before the start of the reform, it was only supply of electricity, or it was centrally planned supply of electricity as well as heat?
Yeah, I understand your question. Not in the case of Chile, we do not provide district heating, and I would say that in all the countries where I have worked, there has not been the situation of providing district heating. I understand that in Hungary you have this situation, and maybe their experience can be interesting. Anyway, I believe that if district heating represents one part of electricity, even 2/3 is important, but still I would say one can consider an electricity market with some forced commitment for supplying, for instance, district heating or for other purposes. So there is not necessarily an issue when setting a market for electricity, if one considers that you have necessarily to provide heating free. That would be a constraint, but you can still operate a power market with the constraint. One should analyze that very carefully, because certainly 2/3 of the power for heating is something that I have never seen. But I believe that you can let the two things work together.
Mm-hmm. The reason why I'm putting emphasis on heating is that if you reduce the generation of heat for existing power plants, you can increase the supply of energy. And if we set, say, supply of energy market as a competitive price and heating market fixed, then I would say the incentive for GENCOs are to reduce heat because of fixed prices, and that would cause further issues down the road. That's like my thinking. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I understand. I really am not prepared to make an assessment on that, because I know that this is a very special situation. Certainly, for instance, it is probable that you should continue to rely on coal because of this district heating provision, which is which cannot be provided in another economic way, because you do not have gas, for instance. So coal would continue to be a main fuel to be used in Mongolia. But I would say that on the margin, electricity can still, if you comply with the constraint of providing heating, on the margin, say the excess capacity that you generate, which is not constrained by heating, can be subject to competition. So the extra megawatts would be subject to competition. And I think that that could work. Certainly, when replacing an old coal unit or installing a new coal unit, which would have a heating obligation, one should have to consider all the costs for PPA matter, for instance. One should consider all the costs of these new units, including the constraint of providing heating, apart from electricity. But for instance, for the operation of the spot market, I do not see any problem on that, because the spot market would be driven mostly by the extra megawatt when you already have complied with the heating constraint.
Okay, thank you very much. In interest of time, I'll have a small question. Okay, before I open up the floor, I'd like to ask another question, and please answer it as brief as you can, possible to have more questions in the end. Why did you, like, there any mechanism to choose 15% of total electricity generation in the first 2 years for unbundling? Because in the presentation you said when the reform started, it was the 15% of the generation was unbundled for a competitive market. So I was wondering, like, was it natural course of things, or did you in the beginning start to say it's 15% and then move to a additional 20% in next 3 years? You know, like, how did you step by step move to the transition?
Yeah, the question arises because Endesa was separated in several generation companies, and all the distribution part of Endesa was split, and it was very soon privatized without any problem. But the generation part of Endesa, which was the core of the company, there was a strong resistance by Endesa employees and chief officers, and even by the member of the board, which were against a privatization policy. So even if the company was separated in several parts, only a small part of them were allowed to be privatized. That represented the 15% that I showed. So these were two small hydro power plants, then a coal power plant was privatized, and in the three initial years, only 15% was able to be privatized. But at the end, so in the following years, the whole two large hydro power plants were able to be privatized, say by the end of the 80s. And then the remaining part of Endesa was sold through what we call the popular capitalism, in which all the shares of Endesa were sold to the public at a given price, which would represent the expectancy of the market at that time. And all of the workers of Endesa and anyone in the market or any person in Chile could purchase this asset. So Endesa was finally privatized through that way. So 100% were privatized through that way, through the popular capitalism.
Okay, thank you very much.
Kind of vouchers.
I see. So one of our participants has a question. So go ahead, Tenso.
Hello. My name is Senso. I'm a trader with Trafigura. So my question is pertaining to the wholesale and the spot market price and the mechanisms for it. So everybody globally will start facing the California duck curve issue, depending more on dispatchable generation of power. So in the setup of the spot price and the PPAs, usually they don't distinguish between dispatchable power and a normal solar or wind. So the grid will become more dependent on either more batteries or dispatchable generation, whether it's fuel oil, gas, or coal gasification projects. So how does the market distinguish these two different price? It's very two different. How's the mechanism?
Yeah, I didn't get I did not get the last part. Maybe how a consumer should distinguish the renewable energy when he's purchasing energy in relation to energy purchase generated through fuels. Is that the question?
If it's normal PPAs, there's no distinction in the price of a kilowatt hour, right? So
Yeah.
how can we set up the market to distinguish and value? When you were saying
You're saying for valuing renewable,
the spot price was zero. Well, it should actually also be negative, right? WTI oil went to negative in 2020, so this should be a market mechanism as well.
Yeah, well, in the case of let me get back to one situation. Maybe it's not exactly what you asked, but in the case of spot price set on the basis of short-run marginal cost, you do not have negative price. You can have negative spot price when you have offered price, but in the case of marginal cost price setting, you have the minimum price you can have is zero, which we have had. As I mentioned yesterday, we had zero marginal cost during 6 hours during the day. Now, when signing a PPA, the supplier has to assess what is the performance of its own technology and how much he would be purchasing in the spot or selling to the spot if he's having more generation than its own PPA commitment. So the role of a pure trader in not a generator but a pure trader, which might be purchasing in the spot and selling through a PPA, can be very challenging in this type of framework, because the spot price can rise a lot, as I showed you in the case of Chile, and you would continue to sell at a given PPA price. So the exposure of pure trader without generation can be very high, and most, I would say, suppliers in Chile are not pure traders, but are generators which have physical assets in which they have decided what are the risks of selling a certain amount of energy at a given price. Let just maybe a comment on what happened in California in 2000. In 2000, in California, the regulator was trusting that spot price would be very low, and they did not allow generator and distributor to sign PPAs. So the rules in California at that time were that the distributor should purchase on the spot, because the expectancy of having low spot price were there, and they had not long-term PPA at stable price. And what happened in the what was called the California crisis is that due to drought condition and to constraint in transmission system, the spot price rise and were multiplied by 5 times or 10 times, and distributor had to pay this price because they did not have PPA. And there was a general bankruptcy of all the distribution company in California. And they later on, they learned the lesson. It is very important to have PPA between generator and distributor, and not rely on spot price, which can get very high values. That is just a comment. Maybe it's not the question that you made, but excuse me for making that comment. This is one of the reasons why in Chile, just even before the California crisis, we did not allow distributors to purchase on the spot market. They must have PPA at stable price.
Okay, thank you, Sebastian. There is another question by Mr. Hurlbat. So, Mr. Hurlbat, floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Sebastian. It was quite informative for us, and because you have got totally privatized energy system in Chile, but we are opposite, 100% not privatized. Yes. So I have several questions. I'm representing the Mongolian Renewable Industries Association here, and I have some interest. Hearing you, I understood that the main precondition for participating in the, you call it fully competitive energy market, precondition is the firmed up capacity of the energy sources. Yeah, is that correct?
Yes, yes.
So in Mongolia, we have a lot of problems with the renewables because none of the 9 existing renewable energy sources have this firming up the capacity. I mean the best battery energy storage system. That's why I know it is very difficult. It's intermittent supply of the energy to the grid. And since our grid is very small, we have a lot of fluctuations in it. And then we're not favorable, frankly speaking. So in order to correct this one, we're looking at installing a lot of battery storages on the transmission and distribution networks. So I have a question. Looking to your capacity, installed capacity, I'm kind of jealous. You are very balanced, yeah? At least you have got hydro 23%, solar 20%, wind 11%, gas 16%. So not almost 70% of the energy comes from the green supply energy sources, and then it's very balanced. So in Mongolia, we are the opposite. And then I have a question. Do you have the battery storage currently? And then how they are participating in this competitive market?
Yeah, it's a good question. The storage issue appeared in Chile in the last 2 years because of the excess or enthusiasm for building solar and wind with no central planning. So everyone installed that. And we have 2 sorts of problems. One is that transmission congestion start to appear because most solar were installed in the north of Chile, and flows in solar hour go from the north to the central area, and there was not sufficient installed capacity. So congestion start to appear in the north, and solar units located in the north, which were injecting their energy in solar hours, they start to have 0 spot price. In order to solve that, many of them are already installing batteries. So BESS, battery storage electricity system. And these batteries allows two things. First, you can store the energy when you have excess supply and the price or spot price is very low or 0, and you can store it at night where the spot price is much higher. For instance, right now, the spot price at night in Chile due to the coal price is around $120 per megawatt hour at night, and 0 at daytime. So it is very convenient to have a storage system, and we have already under construction around 800 megawatt in batteries with between 5 and 6 hour duration for each one. And this storage what they are doing, they convert solar to hybrid. So these storage are being constructed by the owner of the solar power plant, not yet by the transmission company, but by the owner of the solar power plant, in such a way as to make trading of energy between 0 and 120. On the other hand, storage can get a capacity payment because the rules are set that way, because they can guarantee supply at night time when we have stress in the system. So batteries get trading benefits in terms of energy and a capacity payment. And with that, there is a lot of storage going on. Certainly, the cost of storage is high. It's say $280 per kilowatt hour of storage capacity, but the benefits are very high in the case of Chile because the variation between zero spot price, and $100 at night time.
Thank you. So I understand you have got several tariffs making the tariffs for the battery storage supplied energy. So first one is the delivery of the energy to the system, load shifting, and then it has got certain tariff, and then plus that some additional tariff for storing energy generated from the source.
Yeah, it is not a regulated tariff. The capacity price is a regulated price, but the trading is just set by the variation of spot, which is just appear for the equilibrium between offer and demand. So this trading is not a regulated part. From another standpoint, in Chile, we have huge hydro reservoir. I did not show that, but we have around 3,000 megawatts in hydro reservoir, which help to storage and to manage this issue.
Okay, thank you,
so
Mr. Sebastion. So there's another question by Mr. Jamba. Since we have 10 minutes, let us squeeze in two more questions before we finish. So Mr. Jamba, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the very informative the presentation. So everything is very clear. I know what happened. The energy sector reform in Chile. It's one of the good example in around the country, especially for developing countries. So I have just one question regarding during the time we introduced reform in energy sector. So there are several things you wanted to do, change during that time. For instance, changing centralized planning system and reduce the government influence in the planning system, etc. So I didn't see any the price related things. How was the price before reform and after the reform? I guess the price maybe went up. How did they handle this price thing?
Yeah. So I understand your question on how the pricing, the movement in price was managed before and after the reform. That's
yes.
Your question?
Yes,
yeah.
correct.
Yeah, that was this is a very important question. In Chile, prior to making the reform, all prices, even with the vertically integrated utilities, were restructured in order to reflect cost prior to the reform. So the general level of price were okay prior to unbundle and setting up the competitive framework at the generation, transmission, and distribution level. That was one first question. Now, even with that, there were price movement because there were, at the distribution level mainly, there were strong subsidies. For instance, commercial tariffs were almost the double or 3 times the level of which they should be. And there were residential tariffs which were excessively low. And the same case occurred for industrial tariff at the medium tension level, not at high tension. So a movement was progressively made to, for instance, to lower the price of commercial to the adequate level, to the efficient level. This took around 2-3 years to do that progressively, and also to rise residential tariff at least for high level of consumption. And I would say a kind of cross subsidy was kept during that time in such a way as to levelize the price of distribution. But at the high voltage level for industrial and mining company, price were okay or had only small movement. But I agree that the price impact of any reform should be very carefully analyzed before proceeding, and this price should be levelized to the adequate level before letting the market operate. Otherwise, you can have very bad surprise.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. So, anybody? Yes, Ivan.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. This has been great and very informative. I had a question about political will and about the state capacity from a regulatory perspective. Because when early market reforms are done, the market is less competitive, and usually the regulator has a role when the market is less competitive. So one, I just want to understand in Chile's example, how important it was to have political will from across all ministries and the government. And then second, how important was it having capacity and how that capacity to regulate the transition of the market?
Yeah, I understand your question on how the regulator, what was the behavior of the regulator during the transition from the old system to the new system. Is that your question?
I want to understand how you build the capacity to regulate, because it's very important to have the right technical know-how to regulate.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, I would say that the regulator, I was part of the regulator at that time, because the National Energy Commission played during the reform the two roles. It was at the same time Ministry of Energy, because it set the rule of the game, and it promotes the power sector reform, moving to a competitive market, and at the same time the National Energy Commission regulates. I would say that this was performed because there was, I would say, internally a discussion on what would be the main concept to regulate. And certainly there was I would say, a strength agreement that, for instance, a generation price should not be regulated, but set on the basis of a spot of projected spot price, and spot price were calculated inside, and we checked at that moment that the spot price were sufficient to produce the revenues in such a way that the companies could operate. So there was a check at the generation level that the spot pricing system plus the capacity pricing scheme would work. In the case of transmission, we initially, the law established, we wrote the law in such a way that there were not an arbitrary movement of the regulator. So everything was written in the law. How the transmission system would be regulated and distribution, this is written in the law. And the concept is that you should pay for the capital cost, the annual capital cost plus fixed O&M cost plus efficient losses of transmission and distribution under by simulating competition. So you set the price in such a way that you simulate what would be the charge of someone who is just installing a transmission line or just developing a distribution line, a distribution grid. So this rule were established in the law. Prior to establish that in the law, some exercise were made to check what would be the resulting price, which is something that we're suggesting here in Mongolia, in such a way that you do not have a disruption. And finally, the regulator has some degree of freedom when regulating price, but it has to comply with what is in the law and in the bylaws. So I would say a strategic concept in the case of Chile was not giving freedom, too much freedom to the regulator. Just putting that in the law, the regulator has to comply. And in several cases, the companies have sued the regulator because they have been in the margin of complying or not complying with the law. So having very clear rules established in a regulatory framework and legal framework is very important in my view.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Sebastion. It's a pleasure for us. I know the time is almost done for us, and it was my pleasure. And I hope it was a very informative for everybody participated in today's online event. And thank you very much for your time and for your effort to make this concept clear for all our participants here.
Well, it has been a pleasure for me to meet you and share this experience. And once again, if you have question or comment, just send them. I will be very pleased to answer them. So okay. have a good day.
Yeah, we will definitely have, as we are working on a potential path and potential roadmap from the existing situation to a wholesale market. And on this effort, we will definitely have more questions, and it would be, we really appreciate if you can answer them in the future for us. And we will make sure that our system in Mongolia will be set on sustainable path, just like what Chile was able to do in the past. And I'm hoping that the reform door is open both politically and economically at this moment, but we're not clear when the door will close because of the potential political changes in the future. But at this moment, we are confident that there are, at least politically, we are able to pull the reform steps, at least the initial steps, so that the path for sustainable future in the energy sector is set as we plan to do. So again, much appreciate for your time and effort, and we hope to see you again in the future, and we would like to consult with you as we go along.
Well, my pleasure. Thank you very much for your patience.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Sebastion. Have a good day.
Okay. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.